The report arrived in the wrong format. That was the first thing oversight analyst Vane Careth noticed, not the contents, not the classification level stamped across the header in 3 languages, but the fact that the document had been submitted as a physical paper printout, folded once down the middle, and slid under the door of the Galactic Cooperative's Regional Assessment Bureau sometime during the night cycle. No sender identification. No transmission record. No digital origin signature. Just paper, which was a material so archaic that Vane Careth had to ask his junior cataloger what it actually was. "It's compressed cellulose," the cataloger said. "Organic, the humans use it." "Why would they use this?" The cataloger had no answer. Vane Careth unfolded the document. At the top, in standard cooperative script that had clearly been typed rather than printed by any known human interface, were 4 words that would later become the subject of 7 separate interspecies academic papers, 2 diplomatic inquiries, and 1 emergency session of the Cooperative Security Directorate. "We apologize in advance." Nobody took it seriously at first. That needs to be understood clearly, because everything that came afterward, every catastrophic miscalculation, every shattered assumption, every moment when a species that had been managing galactic affairs for 11,000 years found itself sitting in silence trying to figure out how it had been so completely, so thoroughly, so almost impressively wrong. It all started from a position of absolute confidence. The Galactic Cooperative had encountered 214 spacefaring civilizations in its history. It had a classification system for them, a rubric, a threat matrix developed over millennia of contact events, calibrated by the finest strategic minds 12-member species could produce. Humanity had been assessed, evaluated, scored, and filed. Their file was thin. That was the first mystery Vane Careth encountered when he pulled the full record. Not the apologetic paper note, that was merely strange, but the file itself. 43 years of contact with humanity, and their official assessment document was 41 pages shorter than the file on the Mervyn, a species that had never successfully left their home system. 41 pages of absence, of things not recorded because the people doing the recording hadn't thought them worth writing down. The second mystery followed immediately. The file had a secondary classification flag he'd never seen before, not a threat level, not a diplomatic category, but a small notation in the administrative margin that read, "See also, containment incidents resolved." When he searched for those records, the search returned an error, not a classified access error, an error that suggested the files had never been properly created, as if someone had referenced documents they intended to write and then never gotten around to writing them. And the third mystery, the one that kept him at his desk long past his shift cycle, was the assessment score itself. On the Cooperative Standard Civilization Readiness Matrix, humanity had been scored a 2.7 out of 10. Low resource base, limited strategic reach, emotional decision-making architecture rated as a significant liability, combat capability listed as negligible pending technological uplift. There was a note at the bottom from the original assessment team, handwritten in the evaluator's own script, which was unusual and suggested it had been added after the official document was finalized. It said, "Do not provoke. Reason unclear. Flag for review." The review had never happened. Vane Careth looked at the folded paper note again. "We apologize in advance." He looked at the date the note had been slid under his door. He looked at the date the most recent entry in the human file had been logged. The most recent entry was from 6 weeks ago. It was a routine shipping lane compliance report. Humans had been fined, again, for using non-standard cargo containers on the Hellion corridor. The fine had been paid in full within 48 hours, which was actually unusually prompt for them, and the compliance officer who processed the payment had noted it with mild approval and gone home. 6 weeks of silence. Then a paper note under a door in the middle of the night. Vane Careth picked up his communication terminal and opened a channel to his superior. "Director Ospalev," he said, "I think we may have missed something. Missed something regarding which species? Humans." There was a pause on the line. Not a long pause, barely a second, but it was the kind of pause that, in retrospect, meant the person on the other end already knew something they hadn't yet decided to share. "Send me what you have," the director said. "And Vane Careth, don't file this internally yet." The thing about humanity's position in the Galactic Cooperative is that it had become something of a running joke. Not a cruel one, exactly. More the kind of gentle, affectionate condescension one might extend toward a child who insists on carrying the grocery bags despite being physically unable to lift them. Humans were, by every meaningful metric, a junior species in a senior species institution. They'd been granted observer status rather than full membership. They had 2 seats on the Advisory Council, which was technically a governing body in the same sense that a suggestion box is technically a governing body. They had submitted 847 formal proposals to the Council over their 43 years of contact. 6 had been acknowledged. None had been adopted. They kept submitting. That was the thing the other species found most endearing about them, the sheer refusal to read the room. A species with the strategic weight of a very small moon kept showing up to galactic governance meetings, kept raising their hands, kept writing things down on their paper, and submitting them through the proper channels, as if the proper channels were going to open for them, one day simply because they'd been persistent enough. The Murathi delegates called it the human ritual. The Sesovian bloc had a term for it in their language that translated roughly as the polite noise from the small table. Even species that genuinely didn't dislike humans found the whole thing slightly absurd, the way watching someone argue with the ocean is slightly absurd. Not hostile, just categorically misaligned with reality. Commander Sira Voss knew exactly how her species was perceived. She'd been the lead human liaison to the cooperative for 9 years, which meant she'd spent 9 years smiling at jokes she wasn't supposed to understand, accepting condescension she wasn't supposed to notice, and watching galactic policy get made in rooms she wasn't quite allowed into. She was 44 years old, had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who'd learned to treat silence as a tool rather than a void, and she had 3 personal rules that she'd never broken and never explained to anyone. The first rule, never apologize for being in the room. The second rule, always let them think they have more time. The third rule, finish what you start. She was sitting in a conference chamber in the cooperative's regional administrative hub when Vane Kareth's inquiry reached her office. She wasn't in her office. She was in the conference chamber because the Sesovian delegates had requested a non-binding consultative dialogue about proposed adjustments to humanity's observer status. Specifically, a proposal to reduce humanity's advisory council representation from 2 seats to 1 in the interest of streamlining deliberative efficiency. The lead Sesovian delegate, a tall creature with translucent secondary eyelids and a reputation for elegant political maneuvering, had framed this as a kindness. Frankly, he said, we feel it would reduce the burden on your representatives. 1 seat fully integrated is worth far more than 2 seats that are rarely, how do I put this, fully heard. Sira Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. I understand completely, she said. Before we discuss the proposal, I wonder if you received the advisory memo we distributed this morning through the standard corridor. The delegate's secondary eyelids flickered. I'm not aware of any advisory memo. Ah, she said. You'll want to read it, take your time. I'm not going anywhere. The advisory memo, as it turned out, was 14 pages long. Vane Kareth received a copy at the same time as the Sesovian delegation, the Murathi bloc, and in what would later be identified as the most significant detail, the Cooperative's Strategic Infrastructure Directorate. It had been distributed through official channels, logged with a proper transmission signature, time-stamped and formatted correctly in every way except one. The subject line. The subject line read, Administrative Notice regarding temporary relay network transition, no action required. Nobody reads memos with subject lines like that. That is the only way to explain why an entire galactic administrative hub received a 14-page document, and exactly 0 officials read it before the consequences began. The memo was, in fact, a courtesy notification. Humanity, it explained, had been quietly operating a secondary relay network through the Hellion corridor, the same corridor where they'd repeatedly been fined for non-standard cargo containers for approximately 3 years. The network, the memo noted with characteristic human understatement, was substantially complete and had been constructed entirely within the technical exceptions clause of the cooperative's infrastructure charter. specifically the provision that allowed any observer status species to maintain internal communication infrastructure, not exceeding regional scope. The memo defined what regional scope meant by humanity's interpretation of the term, which was, and this was explained on page 9, the page nobody reached, considerably larger than the cooperative standard definition. The network, to use the human phrase buried on page 12, was reasonably extensive. Vane Careth read the memo in full at 11 o'clock in the evening in his office, with the folded paper note sitting next to his terminal. He read it 3 times. Then he opened the infrastructure technical appendix referenced in footnote 7 and cross-checked the relay coordinates against the cooperative's own navigational charts. His hands went still on the terminal. "Oh," he said to nobody. The network didn't just span the Hellion corridor. It covered, he counted again, because the first count seemed wrong, 43 relay points distributed across 19 separate administrative sectors. The kind of coverage that, if you were being uncharitable about it, would allow real-time secure communication between any 2 points in the cooperative's core infrastructure zone without routing through a single cooperative-controlled transmission node. It was, from an infrastructure architecture standpoint, elegant. From a strategic standpoint, it was something else entirely. He called Director Ospalov again. "Director, I found the containment incidents." A long pause this time, longer than the first. "How many?" the director asked. Vane Careth looked at his screen. The memo references 43 relay installations, but the memo is addressed as version 2. I can't find version 1 anywhere in the archive. Another pause. Then the director said something Vane Careth had never heard a senior cooperative official say in all his years of service. "Don't turn on any lights in your office." Here is what the Galactic Cooperative had understood about human cargo shipping. It was disorganized, inconsistent, perpetually in minor regulatory violation, and operated by crews that seemed constitutionally unable to fill out transit documentation correctly. The Hellion corridor fine records alone ran to several hundred pages. Wrong container certification, improper mass declaration, non-standard docking frequencies, failure to pre-register cargo manifests. Every infraction small, every fine paid promptly, which was considered politely baffling behavior for a species with humanity's limited economic standing, since prompt payment of fines was typically a marker of institutional compliance culture, and humans did not otherwise demonstrate institutional compliance culture in any observable way. What the cooperative had not understood, and this is the part that took 3 separate review committees to fully process, was that every single minor infraction had required an inspection. And every inspection had required an inspector to physically board the vessel. And every inspector who boarded a vessel to process an infraction received, by standard procedure, a temporary facility access code for the relevant section of the docking hub. Codes that were time-limited, logged, and immediately expired upon use, unless, as it turned out, someone had identified a specific sequencing vulnerability in the access code generation protocol, and had been systematically, patiently, methodically collecting partial code strings from hundreds of separate inspection events over years, and using them to map the full algorithmic structure of the cooperative's facility access system. Not to use it, just to understand it. The cooperative cybersecurity division later determined that no unauthorized access had ever occurred. The humans had not exploited the vulnerability. They had simply, and this was the part that generated the most internal debate about whether it constituted a hostile act, found it, characterized it completely, and then documented it in meticulous detail in a report that was currently sitting in a sealed file on what turned out to be the Human Relay Network, accessible from any of 43 relay points, none of which were on cooperative infrastructure. "They mapped our lock," the cybersecurity director told the emergency session. "They built a copy of our key. And then they put the copy somewhere we can't reach it and sent us a polite memo explaining what they'd done, and the memo was formatted so our automated systems wouldn't flag it as significant, and we all just," he stopped. "We all just filed it," he said. "In our defense," one of the Murathi delegates offered, "the subject line was, I know what the subject line was." At that moment, and the security footage of the emergency session, would later be reviewed by approximately every strategic analyst in the cooperative with access to the archive. A notification chimed on the session chair's terminal. Every official in the room looked at it. The session chair, a Murathi elder named Vel Oran who had been managing cooperative governance for 60 years and had survived 4 constitutional crises, looked at the notification for 4 full seconds before speaking. "Commander Voss," he said slowly, "is requesting to address the session." The room was silent. "She's been outside this chamber," Vel Oran continued, "for the past 2 hours. According to the corridor logs, she arrived before we convened. She knew. That was the thing nobody could get past. She had known the session would be called. She had been waiting outside the room while they discovered every single thing she had already known they were going to discover. In approximately the order she had anticipated they would discover it, and she had done nothing except wait and let the information move at its own pace. When Sira Voss walked into the emergency session chamber, she was carrying nothing. No documents, no terminal, no prepared materials of any kind. She wore the standard issue gray jacket of a human liaison officer. She'd spilled something on the sleeve and the stain hadn't quite come out. She looked, to the assembled officials of the Galactic Cooperative senior governance body, approximately like someone who had come in from a very long shift and would like to get this meeting finished so she could find something to eat. "Thank you for having me," she said. Vel Oran, who had 60 years of experience and 4 constitutional crises, studied her for a long moment. "You anticipated this session," he said. "It wasn't a question. I anticipated that you'd read the memo eventually," she said. "We budgeted for that taking between 4 and 8 weeks. You're ahead of schedule." "The relay network," he said, "the access vulnerability documentation. The infrastructure the memo refers to as version 2. What is version 1? She looked at him with an expression that was polite, patient, and utterly unreadable. "A question we were hoping you'd ask," she said. "That's actually good news." "How," said the cybersecurity director with audible effort, "is that good news?" "Because it means we're talking," she said. "We really prefer to talk." The room sat with that for a moment. "Commander Voss," Vel Oran said quietly, "how long has your species been doing this?" She sat down in the chair across from him, the small chair, the observer's chair, the chair where humanity always sat, and folded her hands on the table. "Since year 4, she said. "About 8 months after our first proposal was tabled without being read." Year 4. 39 years ago. A species that had been assessed as a 2.7 and filed under negligible pending uplift had begun, 39 years ago, to do something quiet and careful and extraordinarily patient. Not hostile, not illegal, not even particularly confrontational, just thorough. Like someone who has been told they can't come in through the front door and has spent 4 decades learning the exact dimensions of every other door in the building. "There's something you should know," Sira Voss said. "The network, the vulnerability mapping, the relay infrastructure, none of it was ever going to be used against you. That's not what it's for." "Then what?" Vel Oran asked. "Is it for?" "Negotiation," she said simply. "Specifically this negotiation. The one where we ask for full membership in the cooperative, and you agree, and we all get to move forward." The silence that followed was the longest one Vane Karath had ever witnessed in a governance chamber. "You built all of this," the Sesovian delegate said finally, "for a seat at the table." Sira Voss turned to look at him. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has asked a question that is almost the right question. "We built all of this," she said, "because we already knew you weren't going to give us one." The argument that followed lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of an emergency session that was supposed to be classified, and which had, within 40 minutes, been leaked to approximately every major news outlet in the cooperative's information sphere. Because, as the communications director would note with something between admiration and despair, the human relay network had a press distribution function that had apparently been configured 3 months ago. They went through every available counterargument. The relay network was unauthorized infrastructure, except it wasn't, technically, given the exceptions clause. The vulnerability documentation was a threat, except it hadn't been exploited, and the documentation was now publicly filed and would need to be addressed regardless of what happened to humanity's status. The entire operation was a form of coercion, which it was, technically, except that every piece of it was reactive, proportionate, and had been preceded by 39 years of humanity trying the completely legitimate and completely ineffective alternative first. Vane Kareth sat in the back of the chamber and watched and said nothing, because he was a junior analyst and it wasn't his place to speak. But at some point during hour 4, the Murathi delegate leaned over to him and said quietly, the paper note, was there anything else in the file? Vane Kareth thought about this. The file was thin, he said, 41 pages shorter than it should have been. Yes, the Murathi delegate said. I've been thinking about that. 41 pages shorter. Do you know what that means? Vane Kareth looked at him. It means, the delegate said, that whoever originally assessed them recorded everything they saw. They just didn't record what they didn't see. And these, he gestured towards Sira Voss at the other end of the chamber, these people are very, very good at not being seen. The vote came at hour 6. 31 members of the cooperative senior governance body, voting on immediate elevation of humanity's status from observer to provisional full membership pending a 5-year integration review. The provision had never been invoked in the cooperative's 11,000-year history. It existed as a theoretical mechanism for exceptional circumstances. It required a 2/3 majority. The final count was 28 in favor, 3 abstentions, 0 against. The abstentions were from the Cybersecurity Directorate, who submitted a written statement indicating they felt they needed more time to assess the full implications of the relay network before casting a vote. The written statement was, everyone noted, 8 pages long, properly formatted, correctly filed through official channels, and had a subject line that read, Administrative notice regarding voting record, no action required. Nobody laughed. Several officials came very close. Sira Voss did not laugh either. She accepted the vote outcome with the same unhurried calm she'd had at the start of the session, shook hands with Vel Oran in the human style, which visibly surprised him, and then excused herself to step into the corridor for a moment. Vane Kareth, following on an impulse he couldn't entirely explain, stepped out after her. She was standing by the corridor window, looking out at the transit lanes beyond the hub. She was sending something on a small personal terminal. A message. Short one by the look of it. The paper note, he said. The apology. What exactly were you apologizing for in advance? She finished sending the message, put the terminal away, turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't read. The mess, she said. What mess? Everything worked. Everything by any reasonable standard went exactly as you intended. Sure, she said. But you're going to spend the next 4 years reviewing 43 relay installations and trying to determine whether any of them have capabilities we didn't mention in the memo. She paused. They don't, by the way, but you'll need to check. That's the mess. We made work for a lot of people. Vane Kareth thought about that. Version 1, he said. The memo's first version. You didn't answer when Vel Oran asked about it. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I didn't. Is it in the relay network? She looked at the transit lanes again. The ships moving out there, some of them human vessels, he realized, which meant some of them were probably relay linked, which meant she could theoretically see their telemetry from the terminal in her pocket, which meant the original assessment of humanity, Vane Kareth said slowly, was scored by a review team, and the final note, the handwritten one, said, Do not provoke, reason unclear. Who wrote that note? Sira Voss looked back at him. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the chamber behind them, 31 senior officials were explaining to their respective governments what had just happened. Dr. Yemi Ashford, she said. First contact liaison, Earth delegation. She was 26 years old. She was on the assessment team as a junior observer. She wasn't supposed to write anything in the final document, but she did. And she wrote, Do not provoke. She wrote it because she'd been watching the assessment team make their scoring decisions. Every time the team looked at humans, she said later, they saw what was there. They were very good at that, but nobody was asking what wasn't there yet. A small pause. She was my mother. She spent the rest of her career working on the relay architecture. She didn't live to see it finished. The corridor was very quiet. Version 1, Vane Kareth said, is the original plan, the one your mother started. Sira Voss didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was in the way she stood there by the window in a jacket with a stain on the sleeve, in an institution that had ignored her species for 39 years with a quiet that had nothing apologetic in it at all. Can I ask you something? Vane Kareth said. Yes. If we'd voted no, we were prepared for that, she said. What would you have done? She was quiet for a long time. We would have kept submitting proposals, she said finally. Through the proper channels, she turned from the window. We always finish what we start. The 5-year integration review lasted 7 months. The anomalies in the timeline were related to the fact that, approximately 2 weeks after the emergency session vote, the Cooperative's Infrastructure Review Board realized the relay network, which humanity had agreed to submit for joint oversight as part of the integration process, had been operating as critical communications infrastructure for several non-human species for approximately 18 months without anyone noticing. The species in question had not been notified they were using human infrastructure. They had simply found it, used it, and found it consistently reliable. When asked about this during the infrastructure review, the Human Relay Operations team produced documentation showing they had, in fact, sent advisory notices to all affected parties at the time of network activation. The notices had been formatted correctly, filed through official channels, time-stamped and logged. Subject line: Administrative notice regarding regional relay availability. No action required. The Infrastructure Review Board's director, an 11,000-year institutional memory's worth of experience condensed into a single Murathi administrator named HFY, looked at that subject line for a very long time. Then she looked at the human operations team seated across the table from her, 4 people, 3 of whom were in their 30s, one of whom looked to be barely past 25 and was apparently the lead engineer, which should not have been surprising and somehow was. "I want to understand something," HFY said. "Not strategically, not institutionally. I want to understand it as a question about your species." She leaned forward. "You had leverage. You had access. You had capabilities we didn't know about. You could have asked for anything." The lead engineer, young, calm, with the specific stillness of someone who had rehearsed no part of this conversation, nodded slightly. "We asked for membership," she said. "That's all. After 39 years of, that's all we ever wanted," the engineer said. "To be in the room, to be heard, to matter to the conversation." She paused. "The rest was just patience." HFY looked at her for a long moment. "Your species," she said carefully, "is very strange." "Yes," the engineer agreed. "We've been told. You built a communications network across 19 administrative sectors to get a seat in a meeting." "We built a communications network across 19 administrative sectors," the engineer said, "because we thought it would be useful, and because we knew if we asked permission first, you'd say no, and because we had already tried asking permission 412 times over 35 years, and we had gotten very good at noticing when a conversation was not going anywhere useful." She folded her hands on the table, the same gesture Sira Voss had used in the session chamber. Vane Carath would think when he read the transcript later. "We are not a patient species by nature. We are just very committed to finishing things." Vane Carath wrote his assessment report 6 weeks after the integration vote. It was not a thin file. It ran to 417 pages, which was longer than any species assessment in the Bureau's archive. He wrote every page himself, which was also unusual. He wrote about the cargo fines and the access codes and the relay architecture and the paper note under the door. He wrote about Dr. Yemi Ashford's handwritten margin note. He wrote about what 39 years of consistent, quiet, cheerful, apparently naive persistence looks like from the inside, and what it looks like, only in retrospect, only when it's over, from the outside. On the last page, where the standard template asked for an official threat classification, he left the field blank for a long time. Then he typed 4 words and submitted the report. The 4 words were not a classification category that existed in the Bureau's official taxonomy. Several of his supervisors noted this. None of them changed it. The final page of humanity's assessment file, the new one, the real one, the 417-page one that would be read and argued over and cited in academic papers for decades, ended with the classification field reading. See also, what wasn't there yet? Sira Voss read the report on a Tuesday morning in the small office she'd been given in the cooperative's main hub, a real office, with her name on the door, which was still new enough that she noticed it every time, and when she finished reading it, she sat quietly for a while with the last page in front of her. Then she picked up a piece of paper, from a physical stack of it that she kept in the desk drawer, because old habits are old habits, and also because it had worked fairly well the first time. She wrote 3 words, folded the paper once down the middle, and left it on Vane Careth's desk while he was at lunch. He found it when he came back. He read it standing up, still holding his coat. The note said, "Thank you." He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the first note. He thought about 39 years. He thought about the 41 pages of absence in the original file, and a 26-year-old woman who had written, "reason unclear," in a margin, and then spent the rest of her life building the reason. He thought about what it feels like to be in a room that keeps telling you that you don't matter, and to keep showing up anyway, not because you believe they'll change their minds, but because you've decided that your presence in the room is not actually their decision to make. He set the note down carefully. He went back to his terminal. He opened a new file. At the top, where the case header went, he typed, "Ongoing Assessment, Human Cooperative Integration, Active." He had a feeling this file was going to be longer than 400 pages. He was, of course, right. But then, and this is the thing the galaxy was only just beginning to understand, humans tend to have that effect on paperwork, on institutions, on assumptions, on the quiet, comfortable certainty that you have correctly assessed a thing simply because you have looked at it carefully enough. They have a way of being larger than the space you made for them, of filling silence you didn't know was empty, of showing up without drama, without fanfare, in rooms they were never supposed to reach, and sitting down in chairs they were never supposed to occupy, and opening their mouths and saying something patient, ordinary, implacable, that you will spend the rest of your career trying to fully understand. Not because they are the strongest, not because they were chosen or gifted or built for this, but because every rational civilization in the galaxy has a point at which it calculates the cost and decides the effort is no longer worth it. A threshold of difficulty beyond which the math stops working. A moment when a species looks at what it would take to continue and concludes, with perfectly reasonable logic, that stopping is the only sensible option. Humanity simply never found that threshold. Or if they found it, they looked at it the way Sira Voss had looked at the Sesovian delegate who'd offered to reduce them from 2 seats to 1, with that patient, unreadable expression. And then they kept going anyway, not because they didn't see it, but because they had decided, somewhere in those 39 years of submitted proposals and paid fines and quiet infrastructure projects, that the threshold wasn't actually there, that it had never been there. That the only thing that had ever been there was the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that.